All right, well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to another week of our Crop Hour webinar series. Just a reminder, my name is Shelby Pritchard. I am the Integrated Pest Management Specialist here at SDSU and also the moderator for the webinar series. I appreciate all of you taking your time out this morning to be here with us. Just a few quick reminders, there will be 2 speakers today, but just 1 CCA credit, and I will make sure to pull up that QR code at the end of the presentations. And there's also going to be a short little poll that we ask you to fill out, just a couple of questions. Appreciate the time. Our first speaker today is David Karki. David joined SDSU Extension in 2014 and serves as an agronomy field specialist stationed at the Watertown Regional Extension Center. And before joining SDSU Extension, David graduated with both his master's and PhD from SDSU. And in his current role, he primarily focuses on delivering research-based information to South Dakota producers and other stakeholders on topics related to managing crops and cover crops. And today, both him and Sarah are going to be talking about cover crops, basics, and more. So with that, David, you can go ahead.
Yeah, good morning, everyone, and thank you, Shelby, for the introduction. You put it in a very nice way. So this week being a cover crops and soil health week, Sarah and I decided to start out with some of the basics, and more means I think we'll touch base a little more into forages and how cover crop and also cover crop in a rotation in different sequences of crops. So I'll start out with first 25 minutes, half hour or so, and then I'll just leave Sarah to continue. So instead of having a 2 different presentation, we'll just we have teamed up and in doing one long presentation. Okay. Okay. So here is a definition of cover crops I stole from Midwest Cover Crop Council, and I decided to go to Midwest Cover Crop Council because they're the alliance of 12 states in the Midwest, a lot of public land grant universities, and have teamed together and formed an alliance or a council in this sense, and have decided to define cover crops as plants seeded into agricultural fields, either within, outside, or a regular growing season, with the primary purpose of improving. And some of these underlined words, I underlined them myself because I thought those are the important words in the definition. It talks about agricultural fields and having cover in them, and also talks about the purpose, which is probably the biggest important thing in cover crops, why we want to adopt cover crops. And it doesn't talk about improving yields or anything like that. It talks about maintaining and improving ecosystem or ecological characteristics over time. And the interest in cover crops, and although it seems like we have heard about cover crops, and another word that goes hand in hand with cover crops every time we talk about cover crops is soil health. It seems like soil health and cover crops have gone, we have heard about them so much, but compared to other field crops and some of the resources we have dedicated in knowing and learning about other field crops, cover crops seems very new, or we're still in a crawling baby steps right now. So why, some of the reasons that's out there, documented reasons out there why we want to have cover crops is it brings diversity in your current cropping system. And another part we hear a lot about is soil health, and soil health in itself is a very broad term, and can be anything from preventing erosion or eliminating erosion overall, and enhancing soil structure, water infiltration, aggregate stability, you can and bulk density. You can talk a lot of things within soil health. And also another one, one of the major ones is supplemental forage, and also nutrient management, carbon sequestration, managing water cycle or hydrological properties of the soil. And in some cases, cover crops have shown, suppressing pests in the field, and could be many more. These are some of the things that I could think about, when I was making the slide. And we'll touch a little more today in supplemental forage part of things. So last couple of slides, we kind of talked about the general definition and philosophical, reasons for adapting cover crops. Now, looking at local or in our environment in South Dakota, we have two major cropping systems. One is predominantly is corn and soybean in some part of the state. And if you look at corn soybean rotation, give or take, the ground cover will be from April to November, early planting, late harvest type conversation. And there's another one that has small grains and ground cover, again, and if you think about early planting and late harvest, March to August. But other times of the year, the ground remains bare. And if there is any, productive sunlight that's coming, then it just radiates back to the atmosphere and unproductive that way. So I will talk a little more into corn and soybean rotation. Of course, given the window or seasonal window we have in our climate or the northern climate that we have, there are not many cover crops you can select from. But and Sarah will later on touch with what happens after small grains and what are the basics we need to figure out. We need to figure out if we are trying to follow small grains. So following small grains, we know, environmentally feasible. You have a lot of different choice of cover crop species or plant species that's out there. You can get them in a blend, or you can make your own blend, buy individual species, make your own blend. But again, objective is very important. Why we are trying to do cover crops in our system, to know that, and then shoot for that and our long-term goal is another, it's very important. And we did a survey back in 2015 and 16 in not a cover crop meeting. It's more of a general agronomy winter meeting. We did a survey in cover crops, and two main reasons that South Dakota producers have decided to adopt cover crops in their system is soil health and supplemental forages. So for those folks who answered that survey, it seems like they have figured out their ultimate end goal of soil health and forages. So objective is important to think about. So corn and soybean more challenging. I think you all already know this, because short growing window, and we can't do a whole lot after harvesting corn or soybean in our environment, and that narrows down your ability to select cover crops so much that there are only a few species left to select from. And one of those species is winter rye or cereal rye or rye. Don't get confused with the annual ryegrass, because this is a cereal rye. Some folks call it cereal rye or winter rye or just rye. And because of it's been selected not only in South Dakota, but the whole corn belt in the Midwest, where there's corn and soybean rotation. Winter rye has taken off for cover crops crazy, just because of its adaptability in cold weather. And also its rapid spring growth. It overwinters really well, and also puts a lot of growth in the spring if you're looking for that. And other way of establishing cover crop can be in-season establishment, which means you're growing your cover crop and your cash crop at the same time. So here's some pictures of planting cover crops, cereal rye into corn. We suggest following corn, then following soybeans. So when you're thinking about corn crop out there in the field, it's logical to go around like first week of September, or when the corn starts opening up that canopy, and you can seed, broadcast seed through aeroplane, or go right after, immediately after harvesting corn, and then drill seed your cover crop, your cereal rye. So the same field, that the picture in this slide, the week later of planting, you see a little seedling down on the bottom here, a week after, and later on in the fall, and then spring in April, and then this field was planted to soybean. So these pictures are from the same field in Minnehaha County. So there is a study that I was involved in, when rye, had started, come into our state in South Dakota, around that time. back in 2011, 2012 timeframe. And in 2012 and 13 and winter of 2012, 13 and 2013, 14, I was able to, collaborate with Dr. Peter Sexton down at the Southeast Research Farm by Beresford and be a part of the study. And it was done in 2 seeding methods, broadcast. For this study, we hand broadcast it and kind of mimicking the airplane seeding, and also drilling right after corn. And the rye biomass was measured in the spring, right around that heading time. That means, when the rye head was just about to come out of that boot or flag leaf. And then we followed that with soybeans, and then also looked at soybean yield if there was any negative impact from preceding rye crop. So this slide here has a lot of numbers. And there's a couple of numbers I have put in a little blue squares. And, on the first column, you see, corn maturity, 75-day corn, 86-day corn, 96 and 105. And Beresford is recommended for 105-day corn because of heat units that we can get in Beresford. But we wanted to try early corn to see if, getting corn early in the season and having rye, well, what's the benefit of that? And there's the control, and then second column, the control means no rye and broadcast seeded rye around that, milk, half milk line, or first week of September, and also drilled right after the corn was harvested. And then rye biomass was measured in the spring. So these are all dry matter per acre. So you do see that's 4,100 in this one number right here after 75-day corn. And similar things in 2014, we repeated that, and then took the soybean yield in 2013 and 14. And these numbers in the blue squares is so low, this soybean yield in 2014. And I always showed this, figures or these numbers to folks out there just to see what happens if soybean is planted late. These soybeans were planted in July. Because in 2014 June, where we wanted to go sample our rye, and plant soybeans, we couldn't get into the field because of extremely high precipitation that year in month of June. It started in really late May, and then month of June we couldn't go sample our rye for biomass, so that we couldn't go, plant soybeans in timely manner. So, and then we ended up planting in mid-July. But other than that, this slide shows a lot of numbers, but soybean yield didn't get impacted by having rye as a cover crop. And here's the relationship of rye biomass in the spring. So this is very recent data than the previous slides. You can look at how rye puts so much biomass, and this graph goes steep or becomes steeper. I would say, late April, in the month of May. And so the data burn down you have on the x-axis, going horizontal, and then rye biomass pounds per acre on the y-axis. And another thing, if you think about the forages and biomass, it's always quantity and quality remains, inversely related. And you can see that in this picture too, in this figure, the relative forage quality on your y-axis and days after boot stage in rye, and then the slope goes downward. That means the quality or the relative forage quality is going down. And this was the slide graph I took from another study done in Wisconsin. And we can expect the same thing happen here also. And talking about rye and biomass for forages, or soil cover, whatever you want to use it for. There's another study done by Dr. Chris Graham in SDSU Extension. He manages, he works out of, as an agronomist out of Rapid City office out west. So here's some number on forage, quality and quantity. So these three things, winter annuals, winter rye, winter wheat, and winter triticale, and also mixed as a three-way mix, divide that weight by 1/3 and then made a three-way mix, planted in October, and took the biomass sample the next year in June, really early June. but I would like to point out a couple of things here. If you can see my pointer moving here. So they were planted on the same day, and we went out there to look at take the biomass sample on the same day, but rye was at anthesis stage, which means at flowering stage, whereas triticale and winter wheat were only at boot stage. That means they were further behind. And that makes a difference here. If you look at the table, total dry weight of rye is about 4,000 pounds per acre, and other two are way below that. And look at the harvest moisture, rye was lower. But if you go at the quality, then, crude protein, rye was lesser than the other, winter wheat, but more, similar to triticale. And if you look at the quality, ADF, lower ADF in these two, because lower the ADF, better the quality. That kind of shows that rye likes to grow faster in the spring because it was already in the flowering stage. That brings the quantity more, but the little lower quality. But the triticale and wheat. So if you're looking for spring biomass, rye is superior to other two winter annuals we have. And winter wheat that was used was Willow Creek, which is known for its forage characteristics or better growth. And look at the 2021 drought year. So here's another thing we always think about rye biomass in the spring. So 2021 was a droughty year, or the stressful year, in other words. So soybean was planted after rye, 29 bushel. Where there is no rye or nearby checks, 63 bushel. Same thing with corn. And when rye was taken out and then kind of double cropping with forage sorghum, later in this, in the summer or early summer, I should say, 16 tons per acre at the 65% moisture for silage production. So this was done in Southeast Farm by Beresford in 2021 data. And more data from Southeast Farm here. Sometimes you see things just from observation, and then you would like to do little newer things, but from what you see, this is what happened in 2017. So soybean was planted in the field that was rye was little later killed, and then also planted in another nearby field where the rye was early killed about 2 weeks before we planted soybeans. And when the soybean was about R3 stage, that means when the pod was just starting to form, the soybean plants that was planted in the late killed rye wasn't looking that happy, So we decided to take the plant biomass of plant sample of soybeans and send it to the lab. And this is what we get. All the nutrients came okay, but the sulfur was deficient in soybean plant tissues that were planted on the field that was, rye was, killed a little later than the other field. But I'm going to go back to this slide prior here. But if you look at the soybean yield, no rye, early killed rye and late killed rye, the actual grain yield or the soybean yield, seed yield, isn't that different. So there is some deficiency in sulfur, but at the same time, it didn't show in the yield. So this is something to think about. It's not alarming, but something to think about. Look at your soil test results a little more carefully, especially sulfur. And same thing happened in field near producers field north of Madison that I went and sampled. There are other nutrients that looked a little deficient, but sulfur was, statistically talking, sulfur was more different than the control. And another question I get, planting, cereal rye into corn soybean rotation. What happens if we follow corn and let the rye grow in the spring and follow with corn? So this was done in Arlington, South Dakota. Traditionally good moisture site. So there are 3 treatments. Rye that was terminated 3 weeks before planting corn. That was the whole field basically. And rye terminated at planting of corn, and rye terminated at when the corn had just emerged. And here's a picture that you can see with the red dashed line. And it's taken, the picture was taken July 5th of 2018. So one on the right side of the red dashed line is control, or rye that's killed 3 weeks before planting corn. This is rye that was killed at emergence, corn emergence. And you can see the difference in height, the color almost looks like a very drought stressed, but there was enough moisture in the field. We periodically, went in there and then soil sample. So this is not due to not having moisture. It's more of a rye effect. So this picture right here in this slide was taken in July 13th. So you again see the difference in the height of the plant. But on this table that I wanted to show you, we talk about, cover crops and soil health world. We talk about, what happens underneath the soil. So rye does help, improving your microbial biomass in the soil, because you can see 3 weeks prior, at planting and at emergence. So at emergence, when rye was let grow until the corn was emerged, you obviously had, even just 1 year difference, you had more biomass of microbes in the soil. So that's something to think about. Rye does help improving biomass. Microbial biomass, but at the same time, it's going to hurt your corn yield so much that we don't suggest to you to do that. So there is about 40 bushel difference between the field that was killed rye 3 weeks before planting corn versus, when we killed rye after corn was emerged. And somehow there is a nutrient tie-up, allelopathic effect, or the microclimate that's happening right on the surface of the soil that corn is not doing well. It's delayed the whole year and never really recovered from being delayed, early in the season. And there is no loss of stand, but didn't like to come out of the residue. So if you are trying to do rye in the field, it fits better after corn and before beans, because when you're doing beans, you can actually green plant and then kill your rye the day of the planting or the next day. So it doesn't really affect soybean yield. And same, a few more data from Morris, Minnesota. Kruger and his team did a study with rye in a corn silage, corn on corn system, which is a little different than what we were talking in previous few slides, but corn on corn. And it does help with taking up the nitrate from the soil. At the same time, it'll take the moisture from the soil also. So they had also 3 treatments: control, rye that was harvested two days before planting corn, and rye that was killed 2 weeks before planting corn. So similar result, and the yield, silage yield or the biomass, corn biomass, that was really significantly different or lower where the rye was harvested 2 days before planting corn. So corn doesn't fare well, after rye as good as soybean does. So summary, I think I mentioned this already. In our study, soybean yield did not really get impacted by the rye being as a cover crop. And field observations show that corn after winter rye doesn't perform well. But if you have to do it to fit your rotation and what's feasible out there, probably allow about 10 days for the rye to be killed before planting your corn. And few consideration, 40 pounds for cover, seeding rate, but rye does have that allelopathic effect and does want to suppress weed because of good early growth in the spring. If you want to use rye for just the weed suppression, about 75 pounds. And another month that we all have to be really looking at is I would say mid-April to mid-May. You don't want rye get out of hand so that it will take all the moisture that your subsequent crop could have taken and make utilized. So if it's a dry spring, not much snow on the ground, and weather outlook is not looking good in terms of precipitation, you may want to go early in the spring and terminate that rye. Doesn't matter, it follows corn or soybeans. And that's more of a corn and soybean rotation and rye works really well as a cover crop, but with few agronomic consideration. But after small grains, there's a bunch of choices out there for cover crop species and what we can do in our environment, because we still have a good amount of heat units in the season that we can utilize our cover crops a lot better. And biomass production, generally, blends have done really well rather than having one single species. Depending on what time of the year, that kind of tells you what type of species in terms of cool season versus warm season needs to be in the mix. It always different. If you have a full season growing in the mid-June versus after small grain has been taken in early part of August. So something to think about. Growing degree day in August is almost 3 times more than the growing degree days in November. So later plantings always favor cool season species. Here's a picture that's in Lake County, by Madison, taken in 2015. The rye was grown in there, and then it was hayed, blend of cover crops was planted, and the picture that you see is taken in September 1st. So in 2 weeks time, it's ready to be grazed by the livestock you have in the farm and ready to be used for forages. And also this picture was taken also in 2015, but the rye was harvested for grain in Minnehaha County. But when the picture was taken in early part of November, now you can see how much growth that has put. Just looking at radish and turnip, and that's after rye was harvested for grain. So there's a lot of choices you can utilize for fall grazing, and if you have some species that can overwinter, that can be in the mix, and then graze, and then also have take advantage of the regrowth in the spring also. So I'm going to stop here and let Sara continue from here onwards, because there comes a lot of basics in terms of selecting cover crops and how we can utilize in our system. Go ahead, Sara.
All right, before she jumps in, I'll just give her brief introduction. So Sara Bauder has been an SDSU Extension Agronomy Field Specialist since August of 2016. She has a bachelor's in agricultural education and a master's in plant science, both from SDSU. Sara primarily focuses on general agronomy, cover crops, and forages, and much of her time is spent working with producers, speaking at or hosting SDSU extension events, and writing extension articles. And so with that, Sara, you can go ahead.
Thanks, Shelby. You always make us sound good. I don't know if I'm that good, but she makes me sound good, so that's nice. So I'm going to pick up where David left off, and he was talking more about the popular question that we get: how can I fit a cover crop in my 2-crop warm season rotation? And so I'm going to get a little more broad and talk about cover crops as a whole. What are some of our options? And then a little bit more on the forage side, looking at quality and some other kind of creative things that we can do with cover crops and that people have tried locally or that we've done research on. So before we get too far, I know some of these things David touched on, but I'm going to reiterate a few things. We tried not to repeat each other too much. One thing is planting time. And these are approximations, these are guides. None of these are hard and fast, but you'll find that these general windows are typically what is suggested in the Midwest. So if you want to plant cool season cover crops, that's a lot of our grasses, and I'll go over the different species here in a minute if you're not familiar. That would be, about the 3rd week of July, we'd be looking at planting timing. Now, it's still warm, of course, in July and August, but we want to give them time to get started, and so we can really see them grow when the days start to shorten and it starts getting cooler in the evenings. Warm seasons, we can plant anytime from June to about that 1st week of August. And they can really take off, and a lot of them can handle those cooler evenings. They like those hot days. So there's a pretty nice wide window. And when people do full season cover crops, we'll see them, put in a lot of warm seasons for this reason. You can sometimes sneak in some cool seasons or brassicas, but you have to keep in mind that corn and soybean are warm season crops. So these crops are going to grow well when your cash crops are growing well if you're planting warm seasons, and that's an easy way to remember that. And this should allow you to have some forage harvest. And now again, this is in a decent year after September 1st. So if we're looking at some of those government deadlines, and on dry years, those really count if they release different lands for haying or grazing. It should allow you to get a little bit of forage going and get started and have something there by September 1st in a decent year if we've got the moisture for it. But there's a lot of factors to consider when we put out mixtures, and we're usually promoting mixtures unless you have a real particular interest or you're working on rye, like David just mentioned. Mixtures can hedge our bet, kind of spread our risk a little bit. So you get a few more factors involved. Maybe. There we go. So when we talk about species selection, I'm going to just go over these briefly because not everyone's always familiar with what's cool and what's a warm season, or even all the cover crop species that we have to offer. So cool season broadleaves, this is just a list of some of the cool season broadleaves that are available. I've got a picture there, some clover, vetch, and then a brassica down at the bottom. So when we say brassicas, that'd be like a radish, turnip, rapeseed. Those are actually in the mustard family. And I think I have a slide that's going to go over those more specifically, but this is the common cool season broadleaf cover crops that you would see available for purchase in South Dakota. Now, these are specifically the cool season broadleaves, but when we talk about legumes versus non-legumes, that's where things get kind of important when you're making selections. So if you want some nitrogen fixation and you want some legumes in your mix, you have to consider how long they're going to grow, because a lot of times if it's a cool season, especially, and we put it in at the end of the year, it's not going to get a lot of time to really fix nitrogen. But it just depends on when you're planting it and how well it does. So that's one thing to consider. Our clovers are going to be legumes, peas, things like that, that we just need to consider whether we do or don't want some of those legume crops in there. And then diversity. So there's just a huge diversity in these seeds. And if you've ever seen like a seed size cover crop box, it's kind of fun to look at, because we have seed size all the way from smaller than alfalfa to, think of a pea. So that can really matter when we're making a mix and how we keep that mix in concentrate. Sometimes we have to use hulls, like cottonseed hulls and things like that, or you need an agitator in your box. So that should be something you consider. Some of these are going to have more salinity tolerance than others, just naturally, or tolerance to poorly drained soils. If you've got some wet soils, you're going to want to consider that when you're making a selection. And then, of course, winter hardiness. I should be giving you some examples. Like rye, for example, that's not a broadleaf, but in this case, you just want to consider what can handle the winter if you really want something to outlive, over winter. And sometimes people will question brassicas. I saw some turnips or radishes come up in the spring. They must have overwintered. Not necessarily. Sometimes that seed is hard and it just sat there and it was under a snowbank, or they bolted at the right time, and so they were able to come up in the spring. So, some of these are meant to winter kill naturally, but occasionally we do have issues and we'll have a few escapes come up in the spring. So we want to keep in mind that these work well when they're planted in the fall prior to your warm season cash crop. So if there's room in there, you can get some of these cool season broadleaves in prior to corn. Now, when we specifically look at brassicas, because they're so popular, I put in a slide on them. The positives of brassicas are that they do really well in the fall. We can get a lot of growth on them as long as we've got moisture. They produce a lot of biomass, but keep in mind that there's a high water content in brassicas. So sometimes the biomass isn't quite what we think it is. They do some good nutrient scavenging and pest management. It really helps to get a cool season crop in between our warm season crops. If we're in a corn soybean rotation, this can really help us out. They can help break up compaction, but one thing you'll hear a lot of experts say is having these huge radishes or turnip balls, although it's pretty cool, doesn't always mean they're doing the best job of breaking up compaction. Sometimes having more that are longer, so you have smaller radishes, for example, but they're longer and they're reaching down in the soil, that can do just as good of a job with compaction. They can be pretty winter hardy. and they're quick to decompose. And part of that is that high water content. And one thing about these is when they do decompose, you can smell sulfur, right? They smell pretty bad. If you live next to a cover crop field that's freezing in the winter, you get a few days there where it's pretty stinky, but not the end of the world. If you're planting next to your neighbor, you might hear about it. So there's some drawbacks. They don't tolerate poor drainage very well. In some cases, in 2019, I saw a few that survived in places that weren't flooded, but they just don't do real well with wet feet. They have a high sulfur and nitrogen uptake, so keep that in mind. They are going to take some of that from your soil. Of course, there's some nutrient cycling going on, but that's one thing they do. They can choke out other species because they do have that nice branch top portion. They're sensitive to carryover with herbicide, and that's true of a lot of our covers. And they can be tough to kill, like I mentioned earlier. So just keep those things in mind. We can get these crops killed off in the spring, but if we're expecting them to winter kill and they don't, don't be totally shocked if you have some escapes. So when we're talking about cool seasons, and most of the cover crops we see planted are cool seasons for the most part in the eastern half of the state. And then as we go west, we'll see more full season cover crops, warm season cover crops. And part of this is just the trend of corn soybean rotations and what we can squeeze in between. So that's why I'm focusing more on cool seasons on these slides, but I do have a couple on warm seasons as well. So when we talk about grasses, here's the list. You can see the list of grasses I have here that are common to South Dakota. They're usually pretty accessible. There's a lot of hardy options on this list, and they're usually pretty good nutrient scavengers. Our grasses in general are. They're best planted prior, again, to warm seasons, but broadleaves. So we want to get cool seasons and warm seasons interchanged every other. And if we can, we want to try to also interchange a mainly grass mix ahead of a broadleaf crop, or a mainly broadleaf mix ahead of a grass crop, just to keep that diversity in there. So if we're looking at warm seasons, there's not as many options that are readily available. And again, these are summarized lists. I'm sure there's a few things I don't have on here, but these are the common ones we see. So if you're trying to do a full season cover crop, or you had a prevent plant situation where you can put in a cover crop, these are great options. The broadleaves can provide us some good diversity, and the grasses can provide some great forage. So, millet has been very popular in previous years when we've had some crop failures. Of course, corn technically counts in a mix. That can be a cover crop, and any of our forage sorghums and Sudan or sorghum Sudan hybrids are warm season grasses. And many of you who have maybe tried those can see that, they do quite well, typically if we have reasonable weather. So those are some nice options that will give us some good quality feed if we're talking forages. So getting into rates and blends, seeding rates really vary. It depends upon how we're planting. So are we drilling? Are we broadcasting? The timing. And then if you're planting for a forage and you know that ahead of time, sometimes that's our backup plan if something fails. But if we know we're planting specifically for forages, usually we bump up the seeding rate because we're trying to do more than cover the soil. And broadcast seeding, of course, is going to be a greater seeding rate than drilled almost always. Now, when we get into smaller seeds, sometimes the seeding rate's a little closer, but typically we want to keep that seeding rate higher because we're going to have a little bit more failure because they're not incorporating the seed. Excuse me. So blends, so there are a lot of pre-blended options from seed dealers. And if you've ever worked with cover crops, I'm sure you've seen those as an option. Sometimes those can be economical and they take a lot of the stress off of trying to figure out what to plant. But be sure that if you're using any kind of program through NRCS, Equip, SHIP, any of those, that it matches the enhancement or the qualifications of the program, because sometimes the commercial mixes don't match. So it's not as difficult as it seems. You want to take the percent of desired seed times the normal seeding rate that you would use, and that total percent should technically add to 100. But I'm going to show you an example here and kind of explain why that can slightly change depending on what you're doing. So here is just a basic chart, and I know some of you have folks help do this, but it's kind of nice to understand. So I use the drilled seeding rates here, and according to NRCS's spreadsheet. And this is just a mix I'm showing you. It's a mainly grass mix, about 70% grass, 30% broadleaf. And what I did was took that. So if you look at radish, I took the full seeding rate of 8 pounds, took it times 3%. We decided we wanted 3% in the mix, and that gives us about 1/4 of a pound per acre seeding rate. And I did that across the board with all of these. When you add up the seeding rate down at the bottom right, you can see it's going to be about 41.5 pounds of seed. However, in reality, you might change these slightly, and a lot of times we make that percent higher than 100 because we want to overseed a little bit, or we might bump up our seeding rates for forages, for example. This was just a drilled cover crop full seeding rate that I used. So it's not as complicated to create these as one might think, but once we get to this point, sometimes we adjust things based on seed purity, germination, things like that. So we might be adjusting it slightly, but the basic math behind it isn't quite as complicated as sometimes it seems. And I should say there's a great resource for this. NRCS offers a spreadsheet that will calculate most of these things for you. And it's on, if you go to, there's a SD cover crops, it's bit.ly.sd cover crops that shows you that information. And I think I have that resource at the end. So when we're talking about cover crops for grazing, getting a little bit more into the forage side of things, there's a few reasons we want to do this, right? Supplemental forage is the big one. Extending our grazing season into the fall is a really great, popular option, and cover crops provide an awesome way to do that. It gives a nice rest period for our cool season pastures, especially on the east side of the state. We tend to see a lot of pastures that are just overused, and some of that's just due to space and time and, you know, just the way things happen in the fall with harvest. So this is a really great option to kind of give more rest to some of our perennial grasses. And, you know, biomass is, of course, our primary objective. We want to get those cattle or those sheep or whatever we're grazing out there to have something to eat as long as possible. We want to look at quality, depends on what the critters are that are grazing and how high of quality forage we want to have there. So when we talk about all those factors, there's some really good research that's been done. And this is one that was done near Beersford at our Southeast Research Farm a few years back. Dr. Sexton put this together. And basically what this is showing you is the top row is a low residue blend and the bottom row is a high residue blend. So the low residue blend has more broadleaves and the high residue blend, of course, has more grasses. And if you look, the big differences here, like our low residue, high broadleaf blend has a lot more peas, lentils, radishes, and then of course it has fewer grass, so less sorghum, a lot less oats. That high residue blend has 35 pounds oats in it. Excuse me. And then we've got much higher seeding rate with the grass blend, and some of that has to do with, you know, the seeding rates of each species and the seed size. But what they were doing in this study was trying to compare the cattle's rate of gain that they had out there and then compare the effect on the yield of the next crop. So they grazed these for a period of time, and in the end we had some pretty interesting results here, I thought. So essentially, just got to move something over here so I can see. So they observed average daily gain on these blends, and on the y-axis we've got gain. On the x we're looking at the different blends, and then we also labeled them so they're a little easier to look at. So the mainly broadleaf blend that had some rye in it as a nurse crop, it was 31% grass, and you can see it was the lowest on the gain, and it just kind of goes up with our grasses. So the broadleaf blend with oats in it did a little bit better. It was 81% grass, so there was a lot more grass in that blend. And then the two grass blends, the one that had rye in it was real similar to that oat broadleaf blend. And the one that had oats and mainly grasses, 96% grasses, this is what was measured, had the best average daily gain of about a little over 2.5, it looks like 2.6 or 7 there. That error bar is fairly high, and that happens when we have grazing studies because, you know, it's never grazed perfectly even. But with a cell grazing project like this, this is about what we'd expect. You know, our grasses have higher quality, and oats are a very high quality forage option. So we saw just some really great gain with our higher grass options. That doesn't mean we can't put broadleaves in our blends. It's just backing up the information that grasses are just a little higher quality for our livestock feed. So the dry matter content of the blends measured in the fall, typically those are going to outperform a single species. So that's one of the reasons that we suggest blends for grazing. Early planted warm seasons are typically going to produce more tonnage because they had more time to grow, but sometimes we see less protein with those blends. Something to keep in mind. The height of cover crops is a good indication of biomass, of course, when we're talking about dry matter. So approximately, based on research, 1 inch above the ground biomass can be about 200 pounds of dry matter. And I'd say that's probably more in relation to grass than anything, but that's a mixture assumption. So you can roughly look at things, and if you have the cover crop grazing stick, that can help you calculate some of this as well. So the first few inches above the ground might weigh differently in a cool season mix than a warm season mix because of, water weight and different moistures of plants. But warm season grass mixtures tend to contain more tonnage in the first 4-ish inches than the growth above. And when you think about some of our warm season crops, that can probably make sense based on stem ratio and things like that. So just kind of some basic info on looking at the quantity versus the actual quality. And so when we're talking about quality, a few basics to keep in mind is crude protein and relative feed values are usually better in our cool season mixes when we've got legumes and brassicas in them. And those are just a little bit higher quality feeds typically. And those cool season mixes with legumes can really help us out. So quality measures in warm season grasses aren't always the best compared to cool season grasses. That doesn't mean you can't graze them. Lots of people do it. It's just in a comparison, if you're trying to make a decision, a lot of times we see the cool season do a little better on the quality side. And then the mixture of cool and warm season grasses and cool and warm brassicas or legumes can form a really great forage mix because we're trying to get the best of both worlds. We're getting the quality and the tonnage. And so there's no perfect mix, and we usually do this on a case-by-case basis. But these are two totally different blends I have pictures of here. I think there's a couple weeds in both of them, but you get the idea that it really just depends on our objectives, and we can't control exactly what's going to happen, but this gives us an idea. So here's another study, fall grazing. So we did oats after hay in 2021 in Arlington, and this is actually data that David provided me. So this was planted, the oats after hay, planted in late July, and they sampled September 24th. They had dry matter of 2.3 tons per acre, so not bad at all. It was cell grazed, started with about 44 heifers per acre per day. But they were leaving quite a bit of dry matter in the ungrazed cell, more than 60%, and they didn't want to leave. I'm going to assume they weren't trying to leave more than half. A lot of times we'd say try to take half, leave half or so. So they were leaving those heifers for just a little bit longer. And that's always a great thing. If we can leave them out there longer than we planned and still have dry matter there, that's great. So this is just one example of, basically double cropping. It depends on how you look at it. We're not harvesting that with a machine, but we're harvesting it with our animals. So really a great way to utilize the soils. And as long as we're not taking too much off, we're not harming anything per se in this situation. It's totally an advantage. So here is another example of some full season cover crops. And these cover crops were sampled and weighed to get this information. The mixes and the single species were collected from some demo plots that Mustang Seeds did. And you can see the date here on the left-hand side. Those are the planting dates of the plots, and then each cover crop. And it's just kind of showing you the dry matter and the crude protein. And this is just something that, it's a guide. It doesn't mean it's going to be this every time, but you can see that the sorghum Sudan, for example, that warm season grass had a lot of dry matter. Okay, there's 25,000 pounds there, but the crude protein is lower. So that's why we talk about mixes, because we can get that tonnage, but we're not necessarily going to get the crude protein that we did with a triticale, that cool season grass. So, you give and take with these things, but this is just kind of backing up a few of my statements earlier. And again, they're not going to be perfect every time, but we do have copies of this data. If you'd like to look at it more in depth, we can certainly provide that to you. So here's a little bit more on the relationship between tonnage and quality or crude protein in certain cover crops. So this is just, you can see the crude protein. So our quality measurement is on the y-axis, and then our tonnage or dry matter by dry matter is on the x. And basically, the higher the crude protein, the lower the tonnage. That's what this line is telling us. And that's just what we've been discussing. This is various cover crops. It doesn't say exactly which ones, but you get the idea that if you want high tonnage, you're going to typically lose a little quality. And if you want high quality, you're going to lose some tonnage. And that's why mixtures can really provide, some great options for us. And it depends on the cattle you're feeding as well. I know there's not a lot of people that do this, but for example, if you have a dairy cow and you're going to graze her out on some covers when she's not dry and you want some high quality feed, you're probably less worried about tonnage and more worried about quality versus if you have a set of calves out there, that are, you're trying to grow, but you want tonnage out there. So a few considerations for grazing. Now, these are very general. I'm not a veterinarian or an animal nutritionist, but just working in forages for a few years, these are the questions and things that come up. So bloat can always be a concern when you're turning out cattle into something new that's lush and green. You always want to make sure that you feed them well before you turn them out. You provide plenty of water and you provide some dry matter out there. So a lot of times we say, put a bale of grass out there or put a bale of feed that they've been eating out there with them so they can go back and forth, and that can help us. That's certainly not the only things, but those are some simple things you can do. Another way to do it is to ease them out there. Just like you would, slowly a couple hours per day. You're not going to just turn them out cold if you can help it. But in a lot of situations, our cover crop field isn't close to home and we don't have the option to turn them out for a couple hours a day until they're used to the feed. So there are a few ways around that. If you have questions on bloat, you can always ask your veterinarian or an animal nutritionist or contact us and we can help you try to work through that. Some cover crops are worse than others, of course. Cover crop blends should have a significant portion of grasses in them. And typically we say not more than 50 to 60% brassicas. And that can, that's just for tonnage purposes and for quality. We can just be a little safer. If we get too many brassicas in there, there's some sulfur issues that can happen, especially with cattle. So we really want to watch that. Blind staggers, things like that. We don't want to see that happening. Strip grazing or cell grazing is a great utilization of cover crops. Some people try mob grazing, but using some of those grazing techniques can really help manage them. And I mentioned earlier the take half, leave half approach is pretty common. For some producers, that seems like you're leaving too much, but remember, everything you leave is going back to the soil and it's nutrient cycling. So it helps if we can try to leave half or close to that. Also keep in mind that you might have to kind of train your animals on especially brassicas or just new crops that they're not used to. Cattle are typically going to prefer grasses, especially cool season grasses, because that's a lot of what our pastures are in South Dakota. And that's a lot of what our hay ground is in South Dakota. There's some warm season prairie hay out there, but cool seasons tend to take over in our perennials. So they're going to prefer what they're used to. And sometimes it takes a while to get them, they'll graze down those cool season grasses and then they'll move to the brassicas. But typically they're trainable, they learn. You might have to force them a little bit, but they won't starve. Most people's herd will start eating the brassicas before they'll starve. So I'm sure some people on this webinar have experience with that. So when we're talking about just adaptation, a few things here at the end, we always want to begin with the end in mind. David talked about purpose. Why are you seeding this cover crop? You always want to start with that because we want to have 2 or 3 purposes. Maybe you just have one, but typically you can target 2 to 3 and just think of the big picture because that can really help you decide what your mix or even single species should be. So if cattle health is a big one, we're going to be looking at quality, of course, and avoiding some of those more risky cover crops for bloat. If soil health is one, we might be able to interchange that in with cattle health, for example. We could work those 2 together. So just keep a couple things in mind before you put them out there. You want to decide why you're doing it. And having a backup plan is fine. A lot of people will say, I'm putting these out there for soil health, but if I'm short on forage, I might want to use it for that. So we want to keep that in mind when we're choosing our mixture. 2 other things to consider here. Herbicide history is a huge one that gets overlooked quite a bit. We just have to be careful, especially with soybean herbicides, but with any herbicide, go look at those carryovers and the rotation restrictions. And some of our herbicides don't have great labels for cover crops yet. It's improving, they're doing the research, but if you have specific questions, you can contact us. Our weed specialists have done some work on this. We can't tell you to do anything off label, but when the label doesn't say anything, that's when it's a little murky. So do watch your herbicide history. You know, things like Flexstar, for example, a lot of those cover crops or a lot of those soybean herbicides in that family, they have very long restrictions, like 18-month restrictions on some of our cool season grasses. So that's just one example that gets overlooked quite a bit. Insurance, FSA, NRCS, any of those policies and programs that you're involved in, make sure that you're checking with them if that's something you're using when you're planting cover crops. Of course, purpose, again, seed availability and cost. We see a lot of people do Brassica mixtures because it's cheaper in a lot of situations, depending on the year, but that may not be the best reason to choose something. You know, we want you, of course, you don't want to spend, you know, I'm trying to think of something crazy. You don't want to spend a whole bunch of money per acre on these cover crops, but at the same time, you need to get something out of them. So we have to put something in to get something out. Crop rotation, it's awesome if we can fit, like I mentioned earlier, a grass in between our broadleaf crops or before our broadleaf crops and a cool season before our warm season and vice versa. That can really help with pest management and a lot of different things. Termination, if we want it to overwinter or not, that's an important thing to decide before we plant. And if we're doing cereal rye, like David mentioned, we really have to look at the moisture in the spring so we're not hurting our cash crop. Maybe we're going to help it. Weed control, some are better with weed control than others due to ground cover. Soil fertility, do we have a field where we really need to focus on a certain macronutrient or micronutrient? And, you know, these covers, certain covers could help us, legume or not. And then planting timing. I think this is a huge one that's just overlooked a lot of times. When should I plant the cover crop? When is it actually going to come up? How well is it going to do? So don't forget to look at the time and how appropriate it is to plant your blend. And then, of course, there's lots of things, you know, do you have the time for it to manage it? Looking at field traffic, we don't want to have too much field traffic in certain areas. Are we going to have problems with hard seed and regrowth, etc.? So there's always something to consider, but these are some of the big ones that sometimes I get calls on or people will overlook. Soil fertility. So just quickly, growing covers for biomass can require fertilizer, especially nitrogen in a lot of cases with grasses. So depending on your goals, especially if you're trying to do forages, there might be a time when 30 to 60 pounds of N can promote growth. You know, nitrogen doesn't typically hurt us unless we're majorly over applying, but it depends on individual situations like previous crop, present soil nitrogen, you know, manure credits, the mix you're using, and the purpose of the mix. So I'm not telling you that you need to apply 30 to 60 pounds nitrogen with your cover crops, but this can happen. We don't have good data to give you a pure recommendation on this. This is just from what we've seen. In some cases, applying nitrogen is going to help you, which makes sense, especially with grasses and non-legumes, but we have to be careful we're not applying too much, especially on a dry year, so that we would have some nitrate toxicity if we're grazing. So that's really important to keep in mind. And that's why we need to look at the individual situation before we apply any nitrogen. So this is where I pulled a lot of this information from. You know, our website has a lot of cover crop information, and I believe David and Anthony Bly and I put together an article on what to plant when. I think it's a 2020 article, but that one's got a lot of this information in it. SARE provides great cover crop resources. Many of them are free. If you have questions about SARE, David's the guy to talk to. The Midwest Cover Crops Council, it used to be that South Dakota was not involved in their online seed selection tool, but we are now. So a group of us got that information up there with them. So if you go to the MCCC website, that will help you create some mixes. You know, fellow producers using the Soil Health Mentoring Program or the Soil Health Coalition, NRCS, Extension folks, there are some seed dealers that are very knowledgeable as well. So I would encourage you to check out any of these. And like I mentioned, I'll put it in the chat here in a second. There's a short URL for the NRCS cover crops page as well that has some great tools and resources, and I will throw that in the chat. But without further ado, that is the information we've got for you today. Here's my contact information. If you're interested or have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A now, or you can email me. And I'm in a Mitchell office. And then here is David's contact information. And I'm just gonna put a plug in there that in Mitchell at the Highland Center on the 9th, which is that tomorrow? I'm not even sure what day it is. We're having our Winter Agronomy Roadshow. So we still have some openings. If you're interested, come down, join us. You can walk in. The only thing I can't guarantee you is lunch, but I think as of right now, we still have enough food for everybody. So we'd love to see you. You can find that on our events page. Thanks, Shelby.
All right, thank you so much. And then if you want to stop screen sharing, I will go ahead and put up the QR code. All right, and it looks like the poll has been up, and it looked like there were actually a couple questions. One from Tamara was wondering if turnip roots cause havoc with tile.
I'll take a stab at it. Good question, but I don't think turnip will do anything to the tile system. If things got worse inside the soil, I can see the fibrous root system or the grass root system might be going down the tile line looking for something. One scenario could be, if you have a waterlogged condition and then roots can't, breathe, they might be going down looking for that air space in the tile line. But even then, that'll be such a slim chance that I don't think cover crop root system actually tubers or will go all the way down to the tile line to actually get into the tile line to disturb anything. I don't know if I answered that question, but
no, David,
just
I'd
looking
agree.
hypothetically, yeah.
Yeah, typically, anything that's going to get that deep to where your tile's at, unless it's a super shallow tile, which is pretty rare, is going to have such a small, at that point, the taproot would be so small. I haven't heard of a lot of issues.
And there is
there another question?
Yep, there is one more question. It's, will the 2021 drought impact availability of cover crop seed for this year?
There has been talk about that. So there has been some talk about it being difficult to get a hold of certain cover crop seeds this coming year. I can't say whether that's going to happen or not, but a lot of our cover crop seeds come from the coasts, and if they had a dry year and there was some issues, it really could impact what seeds are available and how much that seed costs. But it's kind of like the herbicide shortage and fertilizer, price potential. It's really hard to say, but that is something to keep in mind, definitely.
But at the same time, sorry, Sarah.
Go ahead.
But at the same time, beauty of having different choices of cover crops, we can always substitute one for the other. If you're not finding cereal rye, for example, you can always substitute that with winter wheat or winter triticale. It may not have that much growth in the spring like winter rye does, but still you have a choice. And that can be said for other species too, brassica versus peas versus flax versus other broadleaf, cool season broadleaves. I think that's a good thing about cover crops is you have so many different plant species to choose from. So if a region that grows, let's say Oregon grows some kind of, cover crop seed and they're in this extreme drought, but we can always have something else in a completely different part of the country or different part of the world that's the seeds coming from and substituting. That may require a little bit of talking over the phone or emailing back and forth, but feel free to do that. If you have those kind of questions, how to and substitute and what to do.
Yeah, that's a good point. You can be really creative. That's one nice thing about cover crops. So there's some really good options if one's not available. Things like oats and rye are more locally grown, and you might be able to get those without major issues. So, and I see Tamara put on here, yes. So SDSU is hosting an Agronomy Winter Roadshow tomorrow at the Highland. And unfortunately, somehow due to scheduling. The No-Till Association is hosting their big soil health event at the Highland Center the next day on the 10th. So tomorrow there's an extension event on Wednesday. And on Thursday, there is the No-Till soil health event happening both at the Highland Center and Mitchell. So if you're interested in either one of those, I think you can still sign up.
All right, and if that is it, I think we are finished with questions. So thanks again to David and Sarah.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time.